I didn't plan for it to happen. The heat of his touch, the pull of his gaze, the kiss that unraveled everything I thought I knew about myself. In that moment, nothing else existed. No wife, no family, no rules, just the raw, electric connection between us. But passion comes with consequences, and as reality crashes back, I'm left questioning everything. One night, one choice, and now my life will never be the same. Would you cross the line? I did. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The house was too quiet. Not the comforting kind of quiet, like after the kids had gone to bed and the hum of the dishwasher filled the background. No, this was the oppressive kind, the kind that made Ethan hyper-aware of his own existence. The creak of the old pipes, the faint tick of the wall clock in the kitchen, and the dull hum of the refrigerator. All of it felt amplified, as though mocking the emptiness around him. He sat slouched on the living room couch, his legs stretched out, his hand lazily scrolling through his phone. The glow of the screen lit his face in the dimly lit room, but every swipe felt futile. Social media posts of people he barely cared about, vacations, engagements, smiling families, only widened the gap between his life and the life he once imagined for himself. He locked the phone and tossed it onto the cushion beside him, his frustration simmering. The whiskey glass in his hand had been full when he'd started this futile effort to pass the evening. Now it was half empty, the ice cubes nearly melted. Ethan swirled the amber liquid, watching it slosh against the glass. His wife, Claire, had left for her book club meeting hours ago, and their twins. Well, they were both in college now, their lives brimming with excitement and potential while he was stuck here, in this suburban house that felt too big and too lifeless. He glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Still early. He muttered under his breath, though he had no idea what that even meant anymore. Early for what? It wasn't like he had plans. Claire wouldn't be back until late, and the twins were God knows where at some college party. He didn't begrudge them their freedom. In fact, he envied it. What he wouldn't give to feel something again. Something exciting and unplanned. He leaned back, closing his eyes, trying to remember the last time he'd felt alive. Really, truly alive. The memories were distant and blurred, like looking through a fogged window. Claire was wonderful, of course. She was dependable, supportive, kind. But somewhere along the years between work stress and raising the kids, their relationship had become predictable. Comfortable, yes, but also stagnant. He hated himself for thinking that, for feeling like something was missing when, on paper, his life was picture perfect. The ice clinked in his glass as he took another sip. The whiskey burned slightly, a comforting warmth spreading through his chest. It dulled the ache, but only slightly. He tried turning on the TV, flipping through the endless options of streaming shows and movies, but nothing held his attention. Comedy? No. Drama? Too much effort. Action? It all felt hollow. He left it on a random channel for background noise, the muted sounds of some sitcom laugh track filling the room. Restless, Ethan stood and wandered to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to look outside. The street was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights. Most of the houses were quiet, their residents already tucked in for the night. He caught a glimpse of a figure jogging in the distance. Probably someone younger, fitter, someone with energy and purpose. The sight only reminded him of how long it had been since he'd gone for a run. He sighed, letting the curtain fall back into place, and returned to the couch. The leather creaked as he sat down again, rubbing his face with his hands. He didn't want to admit it to himself, but he was lonely. Claire's absence tonight wasn't unusual, nor was the silence of the house, but for some reason, it hit him harder than it had in a long time. "Get over yourself," he muttered aloud, his voice startling in the quiet, but the words rang hollow. Loneliness wasn't something he could simply brush aside, no matter how hard he tried. It clung to him, a heavy weight that he carried everywhere but pretended didn't exist. For a moment, he considered calling Claire, just to hear her voice, but he knew she wouldn't answer. She hated interruptions during her book club, and besides, what would he even say? "Hey, I'm lonely?" He could practically hear her sigh of annoyance, her well-meaning but dismissive response. "I'll be home soon, Ethan. Just keep yourself busy." Busy. That was the problem. Keeping himself busy wasn't enough anymore. He sat back, staring at the ceiling. The faint buzz of the TV droned on in the background, but it did nothing to fill the silence in his mind. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches of the maple tree in the front yard. Ethan closed his eyes again, trying to drown out the sound, trying to let the whiskey take over and pull him into a haze where the loneliness didn't feel so sharp. For now, this was his life. Quiet, empty, predictable. And for the first time, He felt like it might swallow him whole. Ethan wasn't sure how long he had been standing in the kitchen, staring absently at the darkened window, when the sharp sound of a knock at the door startled him. His body tensed instinctively, the sound cutting through the oppressive quiet like a gunshot. He turned his head toward the front door, his heart skipping a beat. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it. Nobody came to visit at this hour, and Claire always used her key. But then, there it was again. A second knock, firm and deliberate, shattering any illusion of solitude. He set the whiskey glass down on the counter and walked toward the door, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floors. As he approached, a flicker of unease settled in his chest. He glanced through the peephole and saw a figure standing on the porch, illuminated by the weak glow of the porch light. It was Ryan, his next-door neighbor. Ethan frowned slightly, confused. Ryan was younger, somewhere in his late 20s, with a lanky frame and a casual air about him that often seemed effortless. The guy lived alone and mostly kept to himself, but they'd exchanged pleasantries over the years. Polite hellos when they ran into each other at the mailbox, the occasional wave when Ryan was walking his dog. It wasn't unusual to see him outside, working on his motorcycle or lounging on his small porch with a beer in hand. But knocking on Ethan's door at this hour was unexpected. Ethan unlocked the door and opened it, blinking against the cold air that spilled inside. Ryan stood there in a hoodie and jeans, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. His hair was tousled, and there was a faint, almost sheepish smile on his face. "Hey," Ryan said, his voice easy and warm, though there was a slight edge of awkwardness to his tone. "Sorry to bother you this late. I hate to ask, but do you have a wrench I could borrow? My sink's acting up, and I've got water all over the place." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the request. He hesitated for a moment, his mind still foggy from whiskey and the quiet he'd been drowning in all night. Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, sure. Come on in. I think I've got one in the garage." Ryan stepped inside, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Ethan closed the door behind him, feeling the oddness of having another person in the house. The space that had felt so vast and empty just moments ago suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. As Ethan led Ryan toward the garage, he became acutely aware of how close they were. The hallways weren't narrow, but Ryan walked close enough that Ethan could feel his presence. Hear the soft creak of his sneakers on the floor, and catch the faint scent of cologne mixed with something warmer, like the cold air clinging to his clothes. "Thanks for this," Ryan said as they entered the garage. His voice was casual, but there was something disarming about the way he spoke, like they'd known each other far longer than they actually had. "I was in the middle of making dinner and of course, that's when the sink decides to screw me over." "No problem," Ethan said, opening a toolbox on the workbench. "It's one of those nights, huh?" Ryan laughed lightly, leaning against the edge of the workbench as Ethan rummaged through the tools. "Yeah, that kind of week, honestly." Ethan found the wrench and straightened, holding it out to Ryan. Their hands brushed as Ryan took it, and Ethan felt a jolt of something. He wasn't even sure what moved through him. It wasn't just the contact, though that had been startling enough. It was the way Ryan's fingers lingered for just a second too long, his dark eyes meeting Ethan's with a flicker of something unreadable. "Got it?" Ethan asked, his voice coming out slightly more strained than he intended. Ryan smiled. "Yeah, thanks, man. I'll bring it back tomorrow." Ethan nodded, though he didn't step back immediately. Neither did Ryan. There was a beat of silence between them, the kind that should have been awkward but wasn't. Ethan's mind raced with a dozen thoughts, none of them coherent, before he cleared his throat and broke the tension. "Need help with the sink?" he offered. He hadn't planned to say it, it just slipped out. Maybe it was the whiskey, or maybe it was the weight of his loneliness making him cling to the moment. Ryan hesitated, his smile softening into something more genuine. "If you don't mind, that'd be great. It's kind of a two-person job." Ethan nodded again, feeling his pulse quicken for reasons he didn't entirely understand. "All right, lead the way." As Ryan opened the door and stepped out into the cold, Ethan grabbed his coat and followed, the sound of their footsteps echoing faintly into the night. The night air was colder than Ethan expected, sharp and biting against his skin as he followed Ryan across the short stretch of lawn separating their houses. His hands were shoved into his coat pockets, and though he focused on the glow of Ryan's porch light ahead, his thoughts were anywhere but grounded. He couldn't shake the odd awareness that had settled over him the moment Ryan had shown up. It wasn't the first time they'd spoken. Far from it, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way Ryan had smiled at him, easy and casual, or the way his fingers had brushed Ethan's when he took the wrench. Small things, unremarkable on their own. Yet together they had lodged in Ethan's mind like splinters he couldn't quite remove. Ryan unlocked his door and stepped inside, flipping on the light and holding it open for Ethan. The apartment was warm, a sharp contrast to the chill outside, and the faint scent of basil and garlic lingered in the air. Ethan's eyes swept over the space instinctively. It was simple but lived in. A guitar leaning against one wall, an open laptop on the small dining table, a black hoodie tossed over the back of a chair. There was an intimacy to it, a feeling of being invited into someone's private world, and Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd been in someone else's home like this. "Sorry about the mess," Ryan said, shrugging off his jacket and tossing it onto the couch. He smiled over his shoulder, a flicker of self-consciousness in his expression that Ethan hadn't expected. "I wasn't exactly planning on hosting tonight." Ethan waved it off. "You should see my garage. Pretty sure I've got tools in there older than my kids." Ryan chuckled at that, his laugh low and genuine, and Ethan found himself smiling despite himself. He was still trying to work out what it was about Ryan that set him at ease so easily, and why that same ease also left him unsettled in a way he couldn't explain. "This way," Ryan said, leading him toward the kitchen. The sink was a disaster. A small puddle of water had collected around its base, and an assortment of tools and cleaning supplies were scattered across the countertop. Ryan leaned against the edge of the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, watching as Ethan crouched to inspect the pipes below. "Looks like the seal on your P-trap might be loose," Ethan muttered, his voice echoing faintly from beneath the sink. "Shouldn't be too hard to fix. Good thing I knocked on your door, then," Ryan replied, the faint amusement in his tone making Ethan glance up. Their eyes met for a moment, and something in Ryan's gaze, something unguarded, sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Ethan swallowed hard and turned back to the pipes, his fingers suddenly clumsy as he adjusted the wrench. The confined space of the kitchen made Ryan's presence impossible to ignore. He could feel the younger man watching him, the weight of his gaze somehow both distracting and grounding. "I owe you one for this," Ryan said, breaking the silence. "Seriously, I'd probably still be cursing at this thing if you hadn't come over." "Don't mention it," Ethan said, his voice tighter than he intended. He tightened the connection on the pipe, then sat back on his heels. "That should do it. Want to give it a try?" Ryan crouched beside him to turn on the faucet. Their shoulders brushed, and Ethan froze at the unexpected contact. Ryan didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did because he didn't move away. The faint hum of running water filled the silence between them, and Ethan couldn't stop himself from glancing sideways. Ryan was close, closer than anyone had been in a long time. Ethan's chest tightened as he caught the faint scent of Ryan's cologne, the heat radiating from his body. He felt something stir in him, something dangerous and unwelcome, and it took everything he had to push it back down. "It's fixed," Ryan said, grinning as he turned off the water. "You're a lifesaver." Ethan stood quickly, trying to put space between them. "No problem," he said, avoiding Ryan's gaze. "It wasn't much." Ryan stood too, still smiling. "I mean it. Let me at least make you a drink or something. It's the least I can do." Ethan hesitated, his pulse pounding in his ears. He should have said no. He knew he should have. But instead, he heard himself say, "Sure, why not?" Ethan leaned against the counter, the faint clink of ice hitting glass breaking the quiet hum of Ryan's apartment. Ryan moved with an easy, casual confidence as he poured whiskey into 2 tumblers, his sleeves pushed up to his elbows and a slight smirk playing at his lips. The kitchen felt smaller now that they were both standing in it. Ethan tried to focus on anything other than the younger man's presence. The faint scratches on the countertop, the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, but his attention kept drifting back to Ryan. "Neat okay for you?" Ryan asked, looking over his shoulder. "Yeah, that's fine," Ethan said, his voice coming out a little rougher than he intended. Ryan handed him a glass, their fingers brushing briefly. The sensation was subtle, fleeting, but Ethan felt it linger longer than it should have. He wrapped his hand around the cool glass and looked down, trying to push away the nagging awareness of how close they were standing. "To fixing sinks," Ryan said with a grin, lifting his glass. Ethan chuckled despite himself. "To fixing sinks," he echoed, tapping his glass lightly against Ryan's before taking a sip. The whiskey was smooth, the burn spreading warmly down his throat. "So," Ryan said, leaning back against the counter, his gaze steady and curious, "do you do this kind of thing a lot? Play neighborhood handyman?" Ethan smirked faintly, shaking his head. "Not really. Most people around here just call a plumber. You're lucky I happen to have the wrench." "Lucky?" Ryan repeated, his tone light but carrying an undertone that made Ethan glance at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan felt the air between them shift, subtle but undeniable. He looked down at his glass, swirling the amber liquid slowly, willing his thoughts to steady. He wasn't sure what he was feeling or why, but it left him off balance. vulnerable. Ryan's apartment didn't help. It was intimate in a way Ethan hadn't expected. The low light, the faint smell of garlic lingering from dinner, the way Ryan's personal things were scattered around without pretense. It all felt exposed, honest. Ethan wasn't sure why it made him uncomfortable, but it did. "You okay?" Ryan asked, his voice softening. Ethan looked up quickly, caught off guard. "Yeah," he said too fast. "I'm fine." Ryan smiled faintly, but there was something in his eyes, something knowing. "You just seem, I don't know, a little out of sorts." Ethan forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. "Long day, I guess." Ryan didn't push, but his gaze lingered for a beat longer before he nodded. He took another sip of his drink, then set the glass down on the counter. "Come on," Ryan said, tilting his head toward the living room. "Sit down for a bit. You've earned it." Ethan hesitated but followed, telling himself he was just being polite. Ryan's couch was small, and when Ethan sat down, he was acutely aware of the space, or lack of it, between them. Ryan leaned back casually, one arm draped over the back of the couch, his knee brushing lightly against Ethan's. Ethan gripped his glass tightly, trying to focus on anything else. The faint hum of a heater, the clink of ice melting in his drink, the soft glow of the lamp in the corner. It was all white noise to the fact that Ryan was so close, his presence palpable. "You don't take much time for yourself, do you?" Ryan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan blinked at him. "What do you mean?" Ryan shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know. You just seem like the kind of guy who's always looking out for other people. Your family, your neighbors, everyone but yourself." Ethan opened his mouth to respond but found he didn't know what to say. Ryan's words hit closer to home than he expected. "I guess that's what happens when you've got a family," Ethan said finally, his voice quieter. "You don't really think about yourself much anymore." Ryan tilted his head slightly, studying him. "And you're okay with that?" The question caught Ethan off guard, and for a moment he couldn't answer. Ryan didn't look away, and Ethan found himself holding his gaze longer than he meant to. "I don't know," Ethan said finally, his voice almost a whisper. Ryan nodded, his expression softening. "That's honest," he said quietly. Ethan took a deep breath, leaning forward to set his glass on the coffee table. His hands felt clammy, and his pulse thudded in his ears. He wasn't sure why the conversation felt so heavy, so charged, but it did. "You don't seem like the type to ask for help, either," Ryan said after a moment. Ethan smiled faintly. "That obvious, huh?" Ryan leaned forward slightly, their faces closer now. "Yeah, but there's nothing wrong with needing someone else. You know that, right?" Ethan's breath caught in his chest. The words were simple, but they hung in the air between them, carrying a weight Ethan didn't know how to address. He looked away, his thoughts racing, but he could feel Ryan's eyes on him. The tension was thick, electric, and for a moment Ethan thought Ryan might say more. But before he could, a loud knock at the door shattered the moment like glass hitting the floor. Both men froze, the spell broken, and Ethan turned toward the door. "Expecting someone?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. Ryan shook his head, his brows furrowing. "No." Ethan watched as Ryan stood and crossed the room, his silhouette framed against the door as he peered through the peephole. "It's Mrs. Calloway," Ryan muttered, his tone tinged with frustration. Ethan leaned back against the couch, his pulse still racing, as Ryan opened the door. Ethan crouched awkwardly in Ryan's cramped bathroom, the cool tile pressing against his knees as he adjusted the wrench in his hand. The dim overhead light cast faint shadows on the walls, and he could hear Ryan standing close behind him, leaning casually against the doorframe. Too close. Close enough that Ethan could feel the weight of his presence, even without looking. "Let me know if you need anything," Ryan said, his voice light but with an edge of amusement. Ethan didn't respond right away. His hands worked on autopilot, tightening the connection on the pipe beneath the sink. The confined space made his movements feel stiff, unsteady. It wasn't just the lack of room, it was Ryan. The bathroom wasn't built to accommodate two grown men, and Ryan didn't seem to mind brushing the invisible boundaries Ethan was trying to maintain. "I think I've got it," Ethan muttered, more to himself than Ryan. He twisted the wrench one last time before leaning back on his heels to inspect his work. Ryan crouched down beside him, so close their shoulders bumped. The sudden contact made Ethan's breath hitch, and he froze, the wrench still clutched in his hand. "You sure?" Ryan asked, peering at the pipes. He turned the faucet handle slightly, watching as the water dripped steadily into the drain. "Looks better already." Ethan forced himself to focus on the task at hand. "Should hold now. Just keep an eye on it over the next few days." Ryan smiled, and his shoulder lingered against Ethan's for a moment too long before he shifted back, resting against the wall in a crouch. "Guess I owe you again. That's 2 times you've saved me tonight." "Not a big deal," Ethan replied, his voice tighter than he intended. He busied himself by gathering the tools scattered around the floor, but he couldn't ignore the heat radiating from Ryan's proximity. Still, Ryan said, his tone softer now, you didn't have to help, especially this late. Ethan looked up, meeting Ryan's gaze. The younger man's expression wasn't playful now. It was open, vulnerable, his dark eyes searching Ethan's face for something unspoken. For a moment Ethan felt exposed, as if Ryan could see every thought running through his mind. It's not a problem, Ethan said, the words coming out quieter than he intended. His voice barely broke the silence between them. The bathroom felt smaller, the air heavier. Ethan was acutely aware of how close Ryan was, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the dampness of the room. His heart thudded in his chest, louder than the faint dripping of the faucet. Ryan didn't look away. You're different than I thought, he said softly. Ethan frowned slightly. Different how? Ryan tilted his head, a small, thoughtful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I don't know. You're just, I guess I didn't expect you to be so real, so easy to talk to. Ethan felt his throat tighten, a flicker of panic rising beneath the surface. He needed to say something, anything, to break the moment, but no words came. Ryan leaned back, breaking the tension with a quiet chuckle. Sorry, I didn't mean to get weird. It's fine, Ethan said quickly, standing up and brushing off his knees. I should, probably get going. Ryan stood as well, his movements slow and deliberate. You don't have to rush off. You want another drink or something? I'm sure we could find something more exciting than plumbing to talk about. Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his ears. He wanted to say yes, God, he wanted to, but the lines between right and wrong felt dangerously thin. I should get home, he said finally, his voice uneven. He turned toward the door, but before he could step away, Ryan reached out, his fingers brushing against Ethan's wrist. Ethan, Ryan said, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan turned back, startled by the touch. Ryan's hand lingered, his fingers warm against Ethan's skin. His eyes held Ethan's, steady and unreadable, and for a moment, everything else fell away. The house, the marriage, the years of loneliness. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. What are you doing? Ryan let go, his hand falling back to his side, though his gaze didn't waver. Nothing, he said, his tone casual, but there was something in his expression. An invitation, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Ethan's stomach tightened, a mix of fear and exhilaration swirling in his chest. He turned toward the door, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. I'll see you tomorrow, he said, his voice barely audible. Ryan didn't stop him, but as Ethan stepped out into the cold night air, he could feel Ryan's eyes on him, the weight of the moment lingering like a pulse just beneath his skin. Ethan sat in the dim light of Ryan's living room, the earlier tension still buzzing faintly beneath his skin. He'd agreed to stay for one last drink, not because he needed it, but because leaving felt impossible in the moment. Ryan was effortless company, leaning back in his chair, sipping his drink, and throwing out lighthearted jokes. But even as Ethan forced himself to smile and engage in the conversation, the weight of their earlier closeness lingered in the air between them. Ryan's apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt safe and personal. Yet Ethan couldn't ignore the way his heart raced every time their eyes met, or whenever Ryan's leg shifted slightly closer to his. He wasn't used to feeling this way, so acutely aware of someone else, of the distance between them shrinking with every passing second. The night felt suspended in something fragile, as though it could shatter at any moment. You okay? Ryan asked, breaking the stillness. His voice was soft, his gaze steady. Ethan hesitated, his grip tightening on his glass. Yeah, he lied, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, Ryan or himself. Just tired, I guess. Ryan tilted his head, as though he didn't believe the words but wasn't going to push. He leaned forward, setting his empty glass on the coffee table, his movements slow and deliberate. The room seemed to shrink again, the space between them becoming something Ethan couldn't ignore. He felt the pull, that dangerous undercurrent that had been growing all night. Then it happened. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment, the sound abrupt and startling, like the shattering of a glass. Ethan froze, his stomach flipping. The spell was broken. Ryan frowned, glancing toward the door. Hang on a sec, he muttered, standing up and walking across the room. Ethan quickly sat back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The moment the weight of whatever had been building was gone, ripped away by that knock. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to collect himself, but his thoughts were a tangled mess. When Ryan opened the door, Mrs. Calloway stood on the other side, her sharp features illuminated by the porch light. Her expression was equal parts concern and suspicion. Everything all right in here? she asked, her gaze shifting to Ethan, who was still sitting on the couch. Ethan stood abruptly, his body rigid, the guilt practically radiating off of him. Yeah, he said quickly, his voice strained. Just helping Ryan with some plumbing stuff. Mrs. Calloway's sharp eyes flicked back to Ryan. I heard a noise earlier. Just wanted to make sure nothing unusual was going on. Ryan's lips twitched in what might have been amusement, though he quickly smothered it. We're fine, Mrs. Calloway. Thanks for checking in. Her gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment longer before she nodded and stepped back. All right then, have a good night. Ryan closed the door, locking it with a quiet click, and let out a breath. Well, that was dramatic. Ethan gave a weak laugh, though his chest still felt tight. She seems thorough. Nosy's more like it, Ryan replied, shaking his head. Ethan set his glass down and cleared his throat. I should get going. Ryan's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded. Yeah, sure. I'll walk you out. As they stepped out into the cold night, Ethan felt the weight of Mrs. Calloway's watchful eyes, even though the curtains on her window were drawn. By the time he reached his own house, the tension of the evening had solidified into something heavier, a mix of regret, longing, and shame. Ethan sat in the dark living room of his house, his elbows on his knees, staring blankly at the whiskey glass in his hands. He hadn't even turned on the lights when he came home. The quiet of his house was even heavier now, suffocating in a way that felt unbearable. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second dragging longer than the last. He could still feel the heat of Ryan's apartment on his skin, the faint scent of cologne that lingered in the back of his mind. But more than that, he felt the weight of everything that had nearly happened. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, his thoughts spiraling. What had he been doing? What had he been thinking? Sitting in Ryan's apartment, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from him, letting their hands brush, letting himself linger far longer than he should have. He had crossed a line, if not physically, then in every other way that mattered. It wasn't like him. That was what unsettled him the most. For years, Ethan had lived his life by the book. A stable job, a loving wife, 2 kids he would do anything for. But tonight, all it had taken was Ryan's easy smile, his unguarded eyes, the way he seemed to see right through Ethan's carefully constructed walls. And suddenly, everything Ethan thought he knew about himself had cracked open. He took a sip of the whiskey, though it did nothing to calm the storm raging in his chest. His phone buzzed softly on the coffee table, the screen lighting up in the dark room. Ethan stared at it for a long moment before setting his glass down and picking it up. The message was from Ryan. Hey, you okay? The simple words sent a rush of conflicting emotions through Ethan. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He should ignore it, pretend it never came. But his body moved on its own, typing out a response before he could stop himself. Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks for asking. The reply felt too formal, too distant, but Ethan hit send anyway. He set the phone back down and leaned back into the couch, exhaling slowly. The whiskey buzzed faintly in his veins, not enough to dull his thoughts but enough to keep him grounded in the moment. A few seconds passed, and his phone buzzed again. You sure? You left in a hurry. I hope I didn't make things weird. Ethan stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly as he tried to think of how to respond. The truth was, yes, it had been weird. The whole night had been weird. But not because of Ryan. Because of him. His fingers hesitated before typing. It's fine. Just had a lot on my mind. The message felt safe enough, but it didn't stop his chest from tightening as he sent it. Part of him hoped Ryan wouldn't respond. Another part of him hoped he would. The phone buzzed again. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. Ethan set the phone down, unable to look at it anymore. His pulse thudded in his ears, louder than the ticking of the clock. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees again, and stared at the shadows stretching across the floor. His thoughts churned, a mess of guilt, confusion, and an undeniable sense of longing he didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't about Ryan, he told himself. It was about him, about the empty spaces in his life, the things he had buried beneath years of routine and responsibility. Ryan had just been a mirror, reflecting all the things Ethan didn't want to see in himself. And yet, that didn't stop Ethan from picking up his phone one more time, staring at Ryan's last message. The words lingered, tempting him with their simplicity. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. Ethan locked his phone and stood, heading toward the bedroom. But even as he lay in bed next to Claire, staring up at the ceiling, the memory of Ryan's gaze stayed with him, pulling at the edges of his thoughts like a thread he couldn't quite unravel. Ethan paced the living room of his house, his hands gripping the phone like it was a lifeline. The clock on the wall read just past midnight. Claire wasn't home yet. Her book club always ran late, and sometimes she stayed afterward to chat. But tonight, Ethan wasn't focused on her absence. He was focused on the text sitting on his phone, a message from Ryan that he hadn't yet replied to. "Wanna come back?" The words were simple, casual even, but they sat heavy in his chest, pulling him in two directions at once. He had already decided to call it a night, to bury the unease from earlier under the weight of sleep and routine. But Ryan's invitation lingered in his mind, pulling at something deep inside him that he couldn't fully ignore. Ethan stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. His thumb hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. He should say no. He knew he should say no. But the longer he hesitated, the more the pull grew, until it felt like his body was moving on its own. Before he could stop himself, he typed out a response. "Are you still up?" The reply came almost instantly.
"Yeah. Doors unlocked.
"Come by if you want." Ethan's pulse raced. His breath felt shallow as he grabbed his jacket and slipped out into the night. The cold air hit him like a slap, but it did little to shake the tension building in his chest. His feet moved almost without thought, carrying him across the lawn toward Ryan's apartment. His mind was a chaotic swirl of thoughts as he walked, torn between what he was doing and what it might mean. He told himself it was nothing, just a neighborly visit, just tying up loose ends. But deep down he knew that was a lie. Ryan's porch light was still on, the soft glow spilling out onto the walkway. Ethan hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He could still turn back. He could still walk away and pretend this night never happened. But instead he opened the door. Ryan was sitting on the couch, barefoot and relaxed, his legs stretched out in front of him. He looked up as Ethan entered, a small, almost knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Hey," Ryan said, his voice low and warm. "Wasn't sure if you'd come." Ethan closed the door behind him, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Yeah, I wasn't sure either." Ryan tilted his head, studying Ethan for a moment before gesturing to the couch. "You want a drink?" Ethan shook his head. "I'm good." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Ryan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You okay?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers curling into fists inside his pockets. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. Ryan nodded, as if he understood. He didn't press, didn't ask for more. Instead, he shifted back on the couch, his expression softening. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. Just hang out. No pressure." Ethan swallowed hard, the kindness in Ryan's tone cutting through the walls he had tried to build around himself. He nodded, finally shrugging off his jacket and sitting down on the couch. The space between them felt smaller now, even though they weren't touching. Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from Ryan, the faint scent of cologne lingering in the air. Ryan leaned back, his eyes meeting Ethan's with a steadiness that felt almost too much to handle. "You're allowed to feel like this, you know," he said softly. "Whatever this is." Ethan's chest tightened. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," Ryan said. He reached out, his hand brushing lightly against Ethan's forearm. A small, tentative gesture, but it sent a jolt through Ethan's entire body. Ethan looked down at Ryan's hand, his breath catching in his throat. The warmth of it seeped through the fabric of his shirt, grounding him and unraveling him all at once. "I shouldn't be here," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you are," Ryan replied, his voice just as quiet. Ethan turned toward him, their faces closer now than they had been all night. The tension between them was electric, a fragile thread stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. Ryan didn't move closer, didn't push. He just waited, his gaze locked on Ethan's, his expression open and unguarded. The moment hung in the air, suspended in something Ethan couldn't name but felt in every part of his body. And then, before he could stop himself, Ethan closed the distance. Ethan wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was Ryan. But the moment their lips met, the rest of the world fell away. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant creak of floorboards from the apartment above. Everything faded into nothingness. All he could focus on was the warmth of Ryan's mouth, the softness of his touch, and the way his body instinctively leaned closer, as though he'd been waiting for this moment for far longer than he'd ever admit. Ryan's hand slipped to Ethan's shoulder, steadying him, pulling him closer. The touch was firm yet careful, like he was afraid of pushing too far. Ethan's pulse raced in his chest, pounding so loudly he could feel it in his ears. He hadn't been touched like this in years. Not with this kind of tenderness, this kind of urgency. For a brief moment, Ethan let himself fall into it. Into the warmth of Ryan's body, the way their movements synced without thought. It was overwhelming and intoxicating, like diving headfirst into deep, uncharted water. But then reality came rushing back, sharp and cold like a slap to the face. Ethan pulled back suddenly, breaking the kiss, his breathing uneven. He stared at Ryan, his heart hammering in his chest. "I can't," he whispered, his voice strained and heavy with guilt. "I shouldn't be here." Ryan's eyes searched Ethan's face, his own expression unreadable. He didn't move away, didn't let go of Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan," he said softly, his voice calm and steady. "It's okay." "It's not," Ethan snapped, standing abruptly. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling as they tangled in the strands. "This isn't okay. He stopped himself, his words catching in his throat. Ryan stood too, keeping his distance, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "Hey, it's fine. I'm not going to push you." Ethan shook his head, pacing a few steps before stopping to face Ryan again. "You don't get it. I have a wife, kids, a life. I can't just throw it all away because—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Because what?" Ryan asked, his tone gentle, not accusing. Ethan's throat tightened. The room felt too small, the air too thick. He couldn't say it, not out loud. He couldn't admit to the pull he felt, the way Ryan made him feel seen, wanted, the way he hadn't felt in years. Ryan took a cautious step closer, his gaze steady. "I'm not asking you to throw anything away," he said softly. "I'm not asking for anything, Ethan, but you came here tonight for a reason. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just stop running from it." Ethan's chest ached. He wanted to argue, to push Ryan away, but the truth was Ryan was right. He had come here for a reason, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. "I can't do this," Ethan said finally, his voice barely audible. He grabbed his coat from the back of the couch, his hands fumbling with the fabric as he turned toward the door. Ryan didn't try to stop him. "Ethan," he said quietly, and Ethan paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I don't regret it, and I don't think you do either." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, his heart twisting painfully in his chest. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night, the sharp wind cutting through him as he walked back toward his house. Every step felt heavier than the last, and by the time he reached his front door, he wasn't sure if the ache in his chest was guilt or something far more complicated. The door to Ethan's house clicked shut behind him, but the sound offered no comfort. He stood in the entryway, staring at the darkness ahead, unable to move. His coat hung loosely in his hand, his fingers too numb to bother putting it on the hook. The chill of the night still clung to his skin, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. He dropped the coat onto the back of a chair and walked into the living room, where the faint glow of the streetlight outside spilled through the window. The whiskey glass was still on the coffee table, right where he had left it. He picked it up and stared into the empty bottom, seeing his reflection warped by the glass. Ethan sank into the couch, the cushions sagging under his weight, and let his head fall back against the worn leather. His body felt heavy, like he'd been carrying something too big for too long, and tonight it had finally started to crush him. The kiss, Ryan's voice, the way his touch had felt like an electric current, sparking something inside Ethan that he hadn't felt in years. He closed his eyes, but it only made the memories sharper. The heat of Ryan's hand on his arm, the way his lips had lingered, soft but sure, like he'd known exactly what Ethan needed. Ethan's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't regret it. Not the way he knew he should. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. His mind swirled with everything he tried to suppress for years. The cracks in his marriage, the slow fading of intimacy, the sense that his life had become a routine he no longer recognized. He loved Claire, he knew he did, but what they had now wasn't what it used to be. And yet, none of that justified what had happened tonight. The thought of Ryan made his stomach twist. Part guilt, part something else entirely. He knew he should never have gone back to Ryan's apartment. He should have ignored the text, stayed in his house, kept his head down like he always did. But instead, he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. Ethan froze, staring at it where it rested on the coffee table. For a moment he considered ignoring it. But his hand moved almost without thought, reaching for the device. The message was from Ryan. "I hope you're okay." Ethan stared at the words, his chest tightening further. Ryan's concern was simple, genuine, and somehow that made it worse. He set the phone down, unable to bring himself to respond. But the temptation lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room like he could physically shake off the weight of his thoughts. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that magnified every creak, every distant sound. He glanced toward the staircase, imagining Claire asleep in their bedroom. She would be back soon, climbing under the covers without asking where he'd been or why he seemed distant. For a brief moment, Ethan considered telling her the truth. Not everything, but enough. Enough to let some of the pressure escape. But the thought of the hurt in her eyes, the damage it would do to their fragile balance, made him push the idea aside. Instead, he grabbed the whiskey bottle from the counter and poured himself another drink. The burn of it was sharp and unforgiving, but it dulled the edges of his guilt just enough to let him breathe. He sat back on the couch, staring at the phone again, Ryan's message still glowing on the screen. The words lingered in his mind, heavy with meaning. I hope you're okay. Ethan didn't feel okay, but he also wasn't sure he wanted to be. Ethan stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the faint glow of Ryan's apartment across the yard. The light in his living room was on, and through the curtain, Ethan could see the faint silhouette of movement inside. Ryan was awake, probably pacing, maybe even thinking about him. The thought sent a wave of conflicting emotions rushing through Ethan's chest. It had been 3 days since that night. Since the kiss, since he'd walked away, and yet it hadn't left him. Not for a second. Every quiet moment brought it back in vivid detail. The warmth of Ryan's hand, the intensity of his gaze, the way it had felt to surrender to something he couldn't even put into words. And now Ethan was here, staring out the window like a man waiting for a sign. But a sign of what? That Ryan still thought about him? That he didn't regret what happened? That he wanted it to happen again? Ethan sighed and closed his eyes, the guilt gnawing at him again. Claire was upstairs, still sleeping. She'd asked him last night if everything was okay. You seem off, she'd said, her voice soft, hesitant. He'd brushed her off, telling her it was just work stress. She hadn't pressed him. She never did. But now Ethan wondered how long that would last. How long before she saw through him. How long before the weight of what he'd done, and what he hadn't done, crushed everything he'd spent years building. His phone buzzed on the counter, jolting him from his thoughts. He grabbed it quickly, his heart racing when he saw the name on the screen. Ryan. The message was short, simple. Hey, you around? Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind spinning. He knew what he should say. He should ignore it, block Ryan's number, delete the message and move on with his life. But as much as he told himself that, as much as he knew it was the right thing to do, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he typed, "Yeah, what's up?" The reply came almost instantly. "Can we talk?" Ethan stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He knew what talk meant. He could feel the weight of the word, the unspoken meaning behind it. And the truth was, he wanted to talk. He wanted to see Ryan, to be in his space again, to feel that connection he hadn't felt in years. But what would that mean? Where would it lead? His thumb hovered over the keyboard for what felt like an eternity. The house was silent around him, the world outside still and dark. For a moment he thought of Claire, of his kids, of the life he'd built that now felt so far away from who he was. Finally he typed a reply. "Okay, when?" Ryan's response came just as quickly. "Now?" Ethan let out a shaky breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. He set the phone down and leaned against the counter, his hands gripping the edge as if it could steady him. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know where this would lead or how it would end. All he knew was that something inside him had already shifted, and there was no going back now. As he stood there, staring at Ryan's glowing window, Ethan made his decision. He grabbed his jacket and stepped into the cold night, the air sharp against his skin. The silence was heavy, the only sound his own footsteps on the frozen ground. By the time he reached Ryan's door, his chest felt tight, his thoughts a swirling mess of fear, guilt, and a strange, undeniable sense of longing. He raised his hand to knock, and then the door opened. Ryan stood there, looking at Ethan with an expression that was both relieved and unsure, as if he, too, wasn't sure what came next. Neither of them spoke at first. The air between them crackled with something Ethan couldn't name, but he felt it in every part of his body. "You came," Ryan said softly, his lips curving into a small smile. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah." Ryan stepped aside, holding the door open, and Ethan hesitated for only a second before walking in. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound sealing them in, locking the rest of the world out. For better or worse, Ethan knew his life had already changed. And whatever came next, he couldn't stop it now.